Let's have an honest conversation on immigration and asylum in Britain. My name is Attieh Fard. I'm one of the parliamentary candidates in Clacton by-election. I'm standing against 33 other candidates, including Mr. Nigel Farage, the leader of the Reform Party. I'm going to talk about his policies and the impact of his policies on communities and also some of his previous campaigns. I also am going to talk about the policy of another political party. I think their name is British Democrats, and also the Conservatives. And I also want to look at what has happened in the history of British immigration laws as I practice immigration and family law, and I have been practicing law for over a decade, and I've seen how the system has changed. So as an expert, as a politician, as a member of the community, as a migrant myself who is a British citizen now, I want to share what I have seen and what I think can be done in the future. So let's first talk about Brexit and its impact on us managing our borders, especially managing boat crossings. When we were a member of the EU, we had an agreement with all the EU member states under what was known as the Dublin Regulation. It allowed Britain to send back asylum seekers to other EU member states if the asylum seeker had arrived in those first safe countries first. So let's say someone arrived in Spain, and then from Spain traveled to France, from France traveled to Britain, then Britain was able to send that asylum seeker back to Spain, because Spain would have been the first country responsible for that asylum claim. The only exceptions were on family reunion. So if an asylum seeker had, let's say, was a child and had parents in the UK, they could have then come to the UK, and the UK would have taken responsibility for their asylum claim. But otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. As a young lawyer, I had seen deportations happening. It was difficult to stop deportations at the time because you had that agreement in place. And then we witnessed the Brexit campaigns led by Mr. Farage, showing us a picture of young men queuing up to come to Britain. And he said that if we don't leave the EU, they will actually come to Britain. They'll arrive in our country. Mr. Farage was an MEP, a member of the European Parliament. He was very well aware of Dublin regulation, but he never talked about Dublin regulation. He never said that whilst we are in the EU, we can actually send people back to the first safe EU country. But if we leave, we would need separate agreements with all those member states to ensure that we could send asylum seekers back. He never talked about it. He never held the government into account or put pressure on the government so that the government wouldn't go through with Brexit until those alternative safe agreements were in place. So, in my view, that type of campaigning was irresponsible campaigning, because you campaign on an issue, and if you know that your campaign is going to lead to a legal void, basically making the borders more vulnerable, you make sure that your campaign or your specific issue only happens and materializes where you have got another plan that can be effective immediately. You don't rely on other governments to strike agreements, for example, or try to have agreements, come up with agreements with the EU member states after the event. So what happened? We left the EU. The Dublin regulation never was applicable, and I started to see that we actually couldn't deport anyone because we didn't have agreements. Obviously, Spain, Germany wouldn't want to have a separate agreement with Britain, and France wouldn't want to have a lot of people back in their shores. So Britain was left in a legal limbo, and they tried to come up, the previous government tried to come up with alternative agreements, like with Rwanda. And I remember at the time when the Conservatives proposed Rwanda, I wrote to Rishi Sunak before he became the party leader, at the time that he was doing his hustings and trying to campaign to be the party leader. And I wrote to his office and I said, look, the Home Office's own policy guidance says that Rwanda is not a safe country, that we have asylum seekers from Rwanda, political activists who criticize the Rwandan government are imprisoned, and also some tortured. So you are going to have legal difficulty. The response that I received from his team was that Mr. Sunak wants to make it work. And then his government tried to work on treating Rwanda as a safe country. Now, it had legal challenges, but again, I started to see some impact. I started receiving calls from asylum seekers from outside Britain telling me, is Rwanda for real? If it is for real, we are not coming. Obviously, there were some who wanted to come anyway and, take a chance, but a lot of people were waiting to see if it was for real or not. And it was going through some legal stages. There was every possibility that Britain could have put more pressure on Rwanda and make Rwanda much safer country and a place for people to go. But what the Conservatives didn't do, they didn't come up with a safe country, a safe route for asylum seekers at the same time. There is a law in Britain that says if you're an asylum seeker, you have to be physically present in Britain. So a person who is persecuted by an authoritarian regime and who is outside Britain basically cannot apply for asylum when they're outside Britain. So they have to come physically to the UK and apply for asylum here. It's a very old law, and I think it doesn't make sense because we allow people who are connected with the authoritarian regimes and who sympathize with them but necessarily are not on the designated list of terrorists to come to the UK legally, apply for visas from outside the UK, check the documents, but the very people that they persecute, we say, actually, there is no way for you. Just come here whenever you get to Britain, whenever you arrive physically here, we'll then listen to you, to your story. So this law doesn't make sense, but the Conservatives at that time didn't come up with safe routes so that people could have applied for asylum from outside Britain to come to the UK. So if Rwanda and a safe route had gone hand in hand at that time, perhaps it would have been much of a success story, But again, going back to what Reform did, I mean, Mr. Farage in one of his videos said that Rwanda was a gimmick, that it wouldn't work, that you couldn't deport all illegal immigrants. He stood for the general election. He made sure that Reform had a candidate in every seat, and therefore the votes he knew would have been a split. He wanted to put pressure on Labour government and on the Conservatives to try and change their laws as well, hoping that he would be forming the next government in Britain. But in the interim, he would put pressure on the change of the law. The impact and the consequence was that Rwanda was obviously cancelled by Labour. We knew that would have happened. He knew that would have happened. And then after Labour government got into power, Mr. Farage revisited Rwanda and said that he might consider agreements with other third countries to deport illegal immigrants. Well, the term that started by Theresa May, I believe, that her government treating asylum seekers as illegal migrants, that we would look into that alternative agreements for the asylum seekers who come to the UK without a visa. And and again, what I think is that was once again his campaign against Rwanda or his comments about Rwanda were irresponsible, because if you say it's a gimmick, why are you going to revisit it again? If you want to look into having agreements with other countries, why did you stop the Conservatives to have those agreements? So what happened was that where we had asylum seekers who were, for example, from the Middle East, from Afghanistan, from Iran, let's say political activists or Christians, real Christians, genuine ones from Islamic background who would have been persecuted in their country. But let's say they went to Germany or the Netherlands. For whatever reason, their applications were refused based on the laws of, for example, Germany or the Netherlands. They couldn't apply for asylum in any other EU country which was part of the Schengen visa. So I had people contacting me who had told me that their only option was to come to the United Kingdom. And the only option to come was to come here on boats, because these people don't have passports. You apply for asylum. If you have fled your country because of persecution, usually you don't have your passport. You have had cases of people who were in the streets on the way to a house church, got a call, the house church is raided by the authorities, members are arrested, the person then flees, seeks hiding in a different town, family help him to get out, they find a smuggler says, where is your destination? He might say Germany, he might say Britain, he might say whatever, and then he's in the hands of the smuggler. Now they may end up in Germany or the Netherlands, or they may be taken to France, and some of them are under the control of these gangs and some of them are perhaps more free and might be able to navigate freely the route. So it put Britain under a difficult situation. Why? Because Britain became the only other option for a lot of asylum seekers whose claims were perhaps unfairly dismissed or fairly dismissed, I don't know, whatever. For whatever reason, they was dismissed. The other place of safety was the United Kingdom. And because of that legal void that was created because of Brexit, Britain was unable to send asylum seekers back to those countries, so that people would go through the Court of Appeal. For example, in Germany, they go through the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights. A lot of time, asylum seekers would have felt, that would take a long time, so I'll take my chances with Britain, and I'll come to Britain, and then we see them on the boats coming to here. But all of that was because of Brexit. And the fact that we lost the deterrence was because of the fact that Rwanda no longer applied and that there was no other safe routes. Anyway, now under the Labour government, I think what they are trying to do makes sense. They are trying to create that safe route for asylum seekers, albeit we don't have the details, so I can't really say it is the right thing they're doing or not. I haven't seen the details. It seems to be a step in the right direction, because what they're trying to create is a system whereby a community, for example, an organization or a university or an employer here would say, I would like to sponsor an asylum seeker who is an expert, for example, in IT or in aerospace or in design, to to come and work for me, or I want this asylum seeker to come here and study, or I want this asylum seeker to come here and I know that they would benefit our community and I would like to sponsor them. So they are creating this space for asylum seekers to be able to come and integrate in the community. What we are hearing from them is that they're trying to tackle the gangs, networks, how successful they are. Shabana Mahmoud is saying that she's made some progress. We don't know. Boat crossings continue because there's still no agreement. Mr. Farage is saying that he wants to engage the Navy. If he wants to engage the Navy, well, Conservatives wanted to do that back in 2022. I think it was that he criticized them, but now he wants to use the same thing. Okay, he's changed his mind, but he would still need an agreement with France, because you can't just accompany a boat to another country and then that country doesn't accept the boat, and then you've got boats after boats after boats stuck on the sea. What are you going to do with that? So if you've got thousands of boats on the sea, it's a challenging legal matter. And also, the maritime laws have to be double checked. Is he going to change the maritime laws as well? And if so, how? He needs to give the public details of his plans. I think it is unacceptable to say that, yes, I'll send them to France. And by the way, we'll work on an agreement. That's what they're saying. Oh, don't worry, don't worry. They say that we can't make it work, but we will work on it. Well, if you can work on it, you've got to work on it now. We can't have a situation like Brexit where you leave and then you don't have an agreement already in place. So if you're let's say, government in shadow, or you treat yourself as a government in waiting, then you would have to work with the other governments and see if you can come up with an agreement with them and be transparent with the public about your issues and weaknesses and the obstacles that you have. I think we need to stop irresponsible campaigning, to be honest. So that's what's happened with the boat crossing. So any government who wants to tackle it would have to have agreements in place with other countries. Now, whether it's agreement with Rwanda, whether it's agreement with France, or with any other country, there got to be agreements in place. And it's not easy to have agreements because no government would want to receive asylum seekers whom they don't know. Most of the EU countries, they already have their own asylum share of asylum seekers and asylum claims. So why would they want additional claims? Unless the whole world system changes around asylum, which I think could be a novel idea, in a way that the United Nations perhaps would receive all asylum claims from all across the world. There would be a database of skills shortages and skills that asylum seekers can offer, and those shortages and their skills would be matched. Or we can talk about cultures. Maybe a community is an aging community. They don't have young people, and maybe you've got asylum seekers who are young, who can be trained, and then who can help that community. So you assign asylum seekers to a country that would basically benefit from the presence of the asylum seekers. And that way, if all the governments and countries work together and provide a platform, perhaps, that could work. I've met a lot of asylum seekers. All they want is a safe place where they can actually build a home, build a future, have their family, have a home, have a job. When you flee persecution, you are protecting your life, and you want to be able to continue living a dignified life in the future. with your husband, with your wife, with your children, and be able to just live a normal life. So that is why I think the world asylum system has to change. But until then, you need temporary arrangements as well. But the conversation, I hope that world leaders start talking about how to change the asylum system so that, first of all, asylum seekers should be able to carry their passports and identity documents. Secondly, should be able to apply from outside the country just like anyone else, apply for a visa, go to a center, give your biometrics. If you have a passport, provide your passport. If you have a national ID card, provide. If you have a copy of it, provide copies of that. And then there would be background checks with all countries. So that's really important in my view. And hopefully that way, the asylum situation might be managed much better than now. Now, moving away from boat crossings and asylum, I want to talk about one of the reform policies, which is to leave the Refugee Convention 1951. That's one of their pledges. The Refugee Convention 1951 directly deals with asylum seekers who are fleeing persecution, not war. So this is not about men of fighting age fleeing war-torn countries. This is about men and women, young and old, who are fleeing persecution based on their gender, based on their religion, on their beliefs, on their disability, or belonging to a particular group. It was created after what happened in Germany with the Nazis and how they persecuted and how they persecuted the Jews, Polish, the disabled, even twins, people who belonged to a particular group, political activists, even Christians who didn't want to worship Hitler, perhaps, and it was done so that that type of persecution, first of all, would not destroy lives in the way that it did back in 1942 or 44. And today these things currently happen. In North Korea, you do have forced labor camps. If someone doesn't worship North Korean leader and rather says that they are a Christian, they would be sent to a forced labor camp. Not only them, but also their families. In Iran, for example, you do have persecution. So you have people who want a different regime, who want democracy, who fight against a lot of Iranian calls the Nazi Islamic regime, so that other people understand what the Islamic regime does in terms of its gravity. And if you have acted against the regime, you get persecuted, you get imprisoned, you can get tortured, you can actually get raped as a prisoner. And that happened on the Nazi Germany as well. People were raped whilst in detention centers, unfortunately tortured whilst in detention centers. I don't want to go into the details of what happened during World War II. We all know the horrific crimes that the Nazis committed, unfortunately. And these horrific crimes are being committed in different ways in other countries. So the Refugee Convention 1951 deals with that. And it says when someone has a real fear of persecution because of their belief and race and religion, they can then seek asylum. And it doesn't matter if you carry your passport or not. It doesn't matter how you enter a country. As we all remember, like the Sound of Music, if you remember the Sound of Music, when the family left Austria, they left through the mountains, and they may not have carried their papers with them. That's exactly what is happening these days as well. Some people from Iran, they flee through the mountains to Turkey, or even to Iraq, sometimes without papers. So it was designed in a way that anyone who was fleeing persecution could seek refuge in another country. Now, what is happening is that we are seeing a mixture of people fleeing persecution and people who are connected with those hostile authorities, and also people who are economic migrants and want a better life, want access to opportunity. And it's the government's job to be able to discern between these types of people and provide refuge to genuine asylum seekers. When reform says we'll leave refugee convention, that means that there are going to be no mechanism whatsoever for someone who is fleeing persecution and is a real asylum seeker. Now, someone who is connected with authoritarian regimes like IRGC members who came to the UK on the boats, not someone who is an economic migrant who is just coming here to work and then go back to their country or stay and then bring their families here, but someone who is at real risk of persecution. I've seen those people. I'm one of them. Because of my various activities against the Islamic regime, in support of national security here in Britain, and also because of my faith and a lot of other activities that I have done over the years, I could be on the list of Iran's executions, on that execution list. So these things are real. But leaving the Refugee Convention 1951 means that a lot of genuine refugees who are not British citizens yet, but are refugees, are going to lose the basis for staying in Britain. And some people who are going to come in need of coming to Britain, let's say the parents are here, the family is here, or they can contribute and they just love British values, they're not going to be able to come because they won't have any basis to arrive in Britain. Now, I appreciate some British citizens may welcome that, may no longer want any other migrant, whether asylum seeker or not. But I've spoken with a lot of residents who have compassionate hearts and have told me that they actually want to ensure that Britain provides refuge to those people who are genuinely seeking protection. So leaving the Refugee Convention, in my view, is a lazy way to deal with the government's job of discerning which claims are genuine and which are not, of securing our borders and striking agreements with other countries, and of processing asylum claims, coming up with novel ideas. It's just, unfortunately, in my view, is a simplistic way of trying to manage a crisis. It's just that lazy way of dealing with it. The other policy that reform is mentioning is to leave the ECHR. They say that they want to leave the ECHR so that they can deport foreign criminals. Again, in my view, that's a very easy and lazy way of dealing with a crisis that we have, because ECHR basically is European Court of Human Rights, who oversees our courts and makes sure that we comply with our obligations, under the Human Rights Act 1998, for example, right to life and right to family life, right to private life, and it impacts British citizens as much as it impacts a migrant. So British citizens' right to private life, for example, right to privacy is protected by that. And yes, some parties say, okay, we leave the ECHR without a Bill of Rights, but we have common law, and our common law will protect the rights of British citizens. Yes, we have common law, but the common law is not thorough, and it's not designed for our rights under the modern contemporary circumstances. How do you deal with right to privacy or a journalist's right to report without a government intrusion into that, the duty to report freely? So leaving the ECHR, in my view, without a Bill of Rights is, again, an easy and lazy way of dealing with an issue. Some politicians say that we have to leave because some foreign criminals have used human rights to avoid deportation. And, for example, they rely on chicken nuggets used by kids of a foreign criminal, or they talk about, right to family life of another criminal. Now, certain rights under the Human Rights Act are limited. So, right to family life, for example, is limited to national security, public safety, and also right to private life, or freedom of speech, even. So, there are some limited rights. And the common law isn't very much designed to protect family life or private life in a way. So if we leave the ECHR, it is not just so that our courts would have sole jurisdiction. Based on my conversation with the Conservative Party, it is so that there is actually no other right, in a sense. Yes, the common law, there is common law, but there will be a gap, and that gap, there is no guarantee that those gaps are going to be filled, because the position currently is that there wouldn't be any Bill of Rights. And there is another position which requires that immigration and asylum tribunals will be closed. Judicial review will no longer be applicable to immigration and asylum cases, and therefore it would only be the Home Office who would review its own decision. This is going to cause issues. So you leave the ECHR not only to take away power of the judges at the European Court of Human Rights, but you're leaving it saying you're not going to have any judge whatsoever scrutinizing the decision of the Home Office. And by the way, British citizens are going to lose some of their rights as well, and we will work on filling in the gap, but without saying how that is going to happen. Again, in my view, governments have to be held accountable. We have institutions. We've got to have the checks and balances between the judiciary and the government. And also, if we are going to take away certain rights, we have to come up with the local and national common laws that would tackle those in advance. You have to say, okay, these are the gaps. This is the plan to fill in the gaps. But unfortunately, currently, the Conservative Party doesn't have that, and the Reform Party isn't offering that. And the other smaller parties, who are a bit far right anyway, and want all migrants, whether first generation or second generation, deprived of their British citizenship and deported, they actually are not going to get any perhaps debate on this issue. And what is the impact going to be on the people? So if you combine Reform's decision to cancel indefinite leave to remain of thousands of migrants, including refugees. You leave the ECHR, you leave Refugee Convention, then that minority genuine refugees whose lives would be at risk if deported back to their countries are actually going to be sent back to their death sentence. If you deport them directly back to a country that is going to execute them, you're actually sending them back to their death sentence. And yes, reform is saying that they're not going to kill the person directly, but they're actually facilitating the death of that person by a third party, which is another hostile, well, a hostile government, like the Islamic regime of Iran or North Korea, anytimes even China. So it has huge impact on the lives of individuals. And unfortunately, it is serious in my view. It's something that shouldn't be taken lightly. And it's going to have huge impacts on our community because we have thousands of people who are migrant refugees who are not yet British citizens. They may have indefinite leave to remain or may not. We understand that indefinite leave to remains are going to be basically cancelled, and then they would have to apply for work. If they cannot, they wouldn't have any basis to stay here because under the Human Rights Act, well, Human Rights Act will no longer apply under the reforms plan. So whether they have lived here for 30 years, have a house, have a family, that is no longer applicable because there won't be any private right to family life or right to private life, whether or not they have contributed financially to the country, or whether or not they have British husband and wife, or they have British children and grandchildren. None of that will matter once you leave the ECHR without a Bill of Rights. And once you leave the Refugee Convention, those who don't have any other basis to stay here and are at risk of persecution will either have to be detained or deported back to their country of origin or deported to a third country. Now, if they're detained, for how many years are they going to be detained? 10 years, 20 years, 5 years, 2 years, how many years? And if they are going to be sent back to their country, well, is the government really going to do that? I mean, how about someone's right to life? I mean, yes, we have common law, and the common law, perhaps under the common law, right to life is protected. We might also have other international agreements to prevent someone from being tortured, so lawyers can use that as well to stop deportations, perhaps on the basis that the person, if returned, for example, to Iran, could be tortured. And there might be other common laws as well to dealing with extreme situations like that, but it's going to be challenging. So why would you create a situation if you are going to have to either face sending someone to that death sentence, or if you don't face that, you are going to basically have to be challenged. The government would have to be challenged under the common law. It just doesn't make sense. Once again, I think it's an easy, lazy way to deal with the crisis that we have today and to win votes. And we have to be honest and transparent with the voters. That is why I'm doing this video, so that you know that there are going to be legal challenges. And in any case, there will be a moral and ethical obligation and questions that will be asked of the reform government if they come ever into power. But I hope you have seen how Mr. Farage's campaigns over the years has caused or contributed, not caused, contributed to the crisis that we have today in terms of boat crossings, how he still doesn't take responsibility and says we can't send back boats to France because of the ECHR. It's nothing to do with the ECHR. And maybe ECHR has, could play a role, but It's not that easy, but it's all about the agreements that we left after Brexit, and also the inability of the government to have contracts, separate agreements with France and other EU member states, and the complexities about maritime laws and other laws that we have. What can be done for the future? I mean, is there any hope to stop the boats? I think if the government starts the safe routes and then comes up with alternative plans, alternative agreements to send asylum seekers who don't come through safe routes, then that could create some sort of defense, perhaps, for the government in the future. Who knows? We'll have to see. We'll have to investigate. I think you need a team of expert lawyers to work on this, not just a few, not one, not two, not three, from your own party. It needs to be a cross-party effort to work on it. I think the government would also have to start serious conversations at international level, at the UN, and talk about the Refugee Convention, not leave it, but propose new and novel ideas for the international management of the asylum situation. They also, in my view, have to use technology and other means to assess the credibility of asylum claims, to understand if someone, when they say, for example, they are of a particular nationality, to be able to robustly scrutinize that and understand if the person's claim is true or not. If that person is an economic migrant, to understand that they are economic migrants, and then they take action. Also, I mean, we have asylum seekers perhaps from all sorts of countries, or migrants from all sorts of countries where those countries perhaps are not as unsafe as the asylum seeker thinks so. And if the country is safe but doesn't have a return agreement, then obviously one has to think about limiting the visas issued to that country, and creating some further restrictions as well. And one long-term plan has to be our foreign policy. Unfortunately, what I've seen with our foreign policy is that we kind of at times support authoritarian regimes. We allow them to breathe, to carry on, to thrive even. Like in the case of Iran, Germany had trade deals with Iran, UK had trade deals with the Islamic regime. Even after the massacre of 54,000 people by the regime over 2 days, within a month of that massacre, some of the Foreign Office staff attended a party organized by the Iranian embassy to commemorate the beginning of the Islamic regime. These, unfortunately, stances do not make sense. So I think we need to have long-term foreign policies rather than short-term foreign policies. Long-term foreign policies that promote democracy, freedom, and safety in those countries. If we have trade agreements with other countries, we can set conditions, and we can say we would like to see improvement in your human rights situation. We would want you to allow democracy and, for example, for your people to be able to determine their future. We can put political pressure on authoritarian regimes. And I'm sure the governments have done that, but we can do that more robustly. What I read, which was unacceptable in a parliamentary report, I read it, it said that our foreign policy, for example, with regards to Iran, was always 6 months or 12 months. Now, the Islamic regime has over the years killed, tortured, imprisoned, and heavily persecuted political protesters every time there was a movement against the regime. And every time that happened, we saw masses of Iranians afterwards leaving Iran. This year was the only year this didn't happen because Iranians are staying in the country to change the government and are now hoping to be able to change it. But in the past it did. So you had quite a lot of boat crossings that included Iranians. You also had Afghan men coming here. And it wasn't just Iranian men, it was Iranian women as well. You had Iranian girls coming, children coming. And part of the reason is because a lot of Iranians have watched British movies. We watched Poirot when we were kids, Sherlock Holmes, Miss Marple, and those programs were sold by Britain to Iran as perhaps maybe there was a cultural project. I'm not too sure. Everyone learned English at a school. You go to secondary school and you learn English, albeit not at great levels, but you learn it. So the British culture, British language is the familiar. And when you leave countries like Iran, a lot of people want to come to Britain because it's familiar. It's that familiar culture that they watch the movies, they've learned the language, they've tried to learn the culture, and then they come here and they embrace the culture. Most of them embrace it, some of them don't, unfortunately, and some of them have committed crimes, unfortunately. And we know that some of them are connected to even the IRGC, the hostile entities. But the story of immigration and asylum doesn't end here. It carries on. And one of the important issues is our legal immigration. We have created rules for investors, for workers, for students, for people of talent to be able to come and get visas. And for people who are coming here on global talent visas, we allow them to get ILR after 3 years. And then you get citizenship after 5 years of arriving in the UK and having global talent visa. What, in my view, has gone wrong is that our national security has not been very strong when dealing with legal visas, and we have witnessed how people who are connected to hostile entities like the Islamic regime of Iran have been able to get visas and come to the UK and invest. I mean, how was it possible that, for example, the son of the former leader of Iran who massacred 54,000 innocent people managed to have a property portfolio of £500 million in Britain? How is it that people who are connected to them were able to get student visas? I mean, I know of a person who had a student visa for Britain, came here and studied, and then now is on the designated list. It shows that we haven't been robust on background checks. And I've seen it. As someone who has practiced law, as someone who has gone through the system, I can say that background checks have not been very robust. When I applied to come to the UK for a visa, when I did that about 27 years ago, I was interviewed. I applied for a student visa to come and study here. I already had family here and I wanted to join them as well. I wasn't too sure if Britain was my final destination or not, but I was sure that Iran would not be an option anymore because of what I'd experienced already in Iran, being threatened with being executed because I wanted to be baptized and other things as well. So I wouldn't want to go into much details. It's not about me. This program is about immigration and asylum in Britain. So, but what I want to say is that those days you would get interviewed and someone would look into your eyes, ask you questions, and then make an assessment. And then later on, this whole system changed. It became a point-based system to allow perhaps a lot of people being able to come to the UK, maybe mass migration, some people may call it. But I think we might need to reintroduce interviews in some cases. We have them for asylum. We might need them for work visas or global talent visas as well, because people connected with hostile entities, people who may be hostile even to British values, would use this point-based system to come to Britain. And then what you will see over time is a change of culture. So I think perhaps that might be an idea. Another idea is to reintroduce the job advertisement requirements. So what used to happen in the past for work visas was that if an employer wanted to employ someone, the employer had to advertise the job for 6 months. They had to interview others, and if they couldn't find any alternative or any British workforce or someone with, right to work in the UK, migrant with right to the UK, in the UK, if they couldn't find that person for 6 months, they could have then brought in foreign workers. I think that made sense. It made life difficult for employers who definitely wanted an expert person to come to Britain, but it made sense. So rather than coming up with radical reforms of the immigration system that don't make sense in terms of cancelling ILRs and all of that, introduce stricter immigration rules like interviews, like advertising a job for 6 months, and also making other stricter requirements as well. And over time, that will help with reducing the net migration. And we also have to remember that whilst talent is really important, identifying that talent is also a skill for the government. And talent is not always from people who are not persecuted. I'm pleased that, again, I say that and I highlighted that the Labour government wants to introduce safe routes for workers who would have employers in Britain to employ them and help them integrate. Now, I'll conclude with the final point of integration. What we have seen is that asylum seekers or migrants who come to the UK arrive. They arrive, they're left on their own. There is no program of integration. I actually held a few workshops in asylum hotels for asylum seekers who had just arrived in Britain from Middle East and Africa, and spoke about our laws here in Britain, law of harassment, law of stalking, and grievous bodily harm, perhaps. Because some people who come to Britain, they have different cultures. In their culture, for example, if a man beats another man, that man could easily beat the other guy back, trying to defend himself, but, going after that man. But in Britain, that could be considered as an offence. So stalking, harassment, all of these are important. There are other issues as well that matter, but what I've seen is that asylum seekers and migrants are left on their own, usually, without any plans for integration. And I believe that there got to be a plan. You can't blame asylum seekers for not integrating where communities don't accept them readily. There is a difference of culture in terms of, the culture that we have is perhaps protective and conservative and doesn't want others to come in, but at the same time, there is no one going out to teach the migrants about British culture and values and laws and all of that. Not until at least they want to become British citizens, and then we'll have the Life in the UK test, which is very late. So I think it all has to be done from the beginning. There got to be training courses available. There got to be, leaflets, booklets, videos available in different languages helping especially migrants who come from cultures which are very different to British culture to learn about British values and British culture and then try and integrate. And perhaps there could be mentors as well, community mentors for migrants and new arrivals, and that can be done. If there is political will, that can be done. And then when you have perhaps a mentor to help a migrant, that mentor can detect if that person has behavior which could be criminal or which is rather unhealthy, and then that way, help perhaps could be provided or intervention can be implemented at early stages, hopefully reducing crime rates. And this has been a long video on the issue of immigration and asylum, but I hope I have provided some detailed information. And if you have any questions on this, I would be happy to speak with you and provide further information. Thank you for your time, and I hope that you would stay in touch.